The music floated gently through the air like the last breath of the day. Under the soft golden glow that shimmered off wine glasses and Crystal Manhattan's Crown restaurant sank into a silence so refined that every motion carried a ceremonial weight. Knives and forks halted midair, suspended in surprise, as if time had paused to make way for a moment no one could have foreseen. Between two tightly spaced rows of elegant chairs, a boy of about 10, his legs bound in steel braces, stepped forward with visible tremors. His face, pale, arms tense, fighting back the nameless pain rooted in his broken limbs. But what silenced the room wasn't the braces on his legs. It was the small hand extended, trembling, yet determined, reaching toward a black waitress cleaning up the next table. Diana Johnson, her face bare and eyes calm like still water, stood frozen. She had worked here for 5 years. 5 years learning how to disappear in a world of tailored suits and conversations measured in stocks and returns. 5 years mastering the art of avoiding the gaze of men like Richard Montgomery. And now it was his son who reached out to her. In this world of hushed formality and unwritten rules, the boy's gesture felt like a glitch in the system, something outrageous, unacceptable. Then came the voice of the manager, cold and sharp. "Make the boy sit down. This is a restaurant, not a dance floor. Staff are not here for entertainment." The words carried the weight of someone who believed rules were law. Diana didn't move. Neither did Richard Montgomery. He remained seated, lips, tight eyes locked on his plate, as if trying to erase the presence of his own son. This was a man who had once sent shockwaves through Wall Street, but now in front of his son he looked small. Lucas didn't speak. His hand stayed outstretched, suspended in the air, waiting, hoping. Maybe he didn't fully grasp the stares closing in on him, but he could feel the rejection that hung thick in the room. That's when Diana took off her apron. She folded it with quiet resolve, laid it on the tray like someone discarding rules that no longer made sense, then stepped forward. She didn't glance at Richard, didn't ask for permission, didn't wait for anyone's approval. She simply smiled and took the waiting hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. No one moved. No one dared breathe. Only the soft metallic scrape of Lucas's braces brushing the marble floor could be heard as he dragged his feet ahead. He didn't know how to dance, had no sense of rhythm, and carried none of the grace expected in this room. But he was leading, and Diana followed. She didn't guide him, didn't adjust his steps, didn't correct his posture. She simply moved with him, gentle and patient. 3 steps, then 4, each one scraping against the pride of those seated around them. A black woman daring to defy protocol. A disabled boy claiming space in a sanctuary of privilege. From a corner table, a woman whispered, "She's getting fired." But Diana didn't care. Neither did Lucas. He was smiling. For the first time since the accident, in Richard Montgomery's mind flashed an image of his late wife Elizabeth swaying with Lucas in the living room one autumn night. She used to say, "It's not perfection that moves us, but connection." Today, the boy wasn't being led. He wasn't being corrected. He simply needed someone willing to walk with him. When Lucas returned to the table and offered a thank you with the grace of a young gentleman, Diana responded quietly, "Thank you for inviting me." Then she turned and walked away. That was the moment Richard stood up. His voice cracked. "What's your name?" "Diana Johnson," she replied without emotion. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a business card, and handed it to her. "My office. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning." The restaurant fell into a deeper silence. a summons from a man whose disapproval could end careers with a word, but Diana showed no reaction. She accepted the card with her right hand, while her left held her empty tray steady. Then Lucas asked Dad, "Why did you do that?" Richard turned to his son. The question hung in the air like an accusation. No one had an answer, because this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about a child forcing a crack into his father's carefully managed world. Diana left, not with the air of someone who had made a reckless mistake, but like a woman who knew exactly what she was doing. Her gaze swept across the room calmly, no longer fearful, no longer invisible. Meanwhile, Richard Montgomery sat still watching her leave, as if seeing something he couldn't quantify with numbers or control with power. And Lucas, barely learning how to walk again, had made a mark on every person who believed they had nothing left to learn. It began with a dance. But the real movement wasn't in the feet, it was in the heart. Sometimes life doesn't change through thunderous declarations. Sometimes it only takes a nod, a hand reaching out, and the courage to follow. The morning sun sliced through Manhattan's glass towers, bouncing off the grand facade of Montgomery Tower headquarters of one of the most powerful financial empires in America. Amid the flow of perfectly tailored suits and polished leather shoes, a petite figure in a navy dress and white blouse stepped into the main lobby. Diana Johnson clutched her worn handbag tightly and took a slow, steady breath. She knew exactly where she was. She could feel the scanning eyes of the front desk receptionist tracing every thread of her outfit, measuring her worth by the discount tag stitched inside her clothes. She had come to meet Richard Montgomery, a billionaire, a man whose name shook Wall Street, and the one who just last night had handed her a business card while barely containing his frustration at a broken dinner ritual. Diana had no idea what he wanted. She harbored no illusions, but she came, not out of curiosity, not out of fear. She came because she knew one thing to be true, that the world only changes when someone dares to cross the lines others pretend not to see, even if it's just with a simple nod. The elevator stopped on the 18th floor. The woman escorting her was named Winters. Her presence was cold, professional, almost harsh. She didn't make small talk. She only turned around once and asked, "Is he going to fire you?" Diana smiled. Winters pushed her glasses higher on her nose and muttered dryly, "People like you don't last long in places like this." Diana asked calmly, "And what kind of place is this?" Winters said nothing. Richard Montgomery's office took up nearly half the floor. The glass walls opened up to the skyline like he was standing atop the world. When Diana stepped in, he was facing away, gazing down at the city, like a man who had grown used to pulling its strings. He didn't turn right away. The silence stretched unnaturally long, the kind meant to tilt power. But Diana stayed quiet. Silence, when wielded well, is its own authority. Richard eventually turned, gave a slight nod, and gestured for her to sit. She did back straight legs, still not a hint of submission. He asked about her education. She answered succinctly, "A degree in child development from NYU, briefly pursued a master's in special education before dropping out to care for her sister." His eyes flickered with the faintest trace of surprise. Then he asked, "Why wait tables?" "3 jobs," she replied. "Waiting tables, selling books on weekends, and tutoring when there are students." He pulled a folder from his desk drawer. "I had you looked into. I needed to know who the woman was who did what even my son's top therapist could not." Inside the folder were photographs, documents, faded articles, freedom steps, a small program she co-founded with her sister 6 years ago, a dance center for children with mobility disabilities. A program now on the verge of shutting down due to lack of funding. Diana wasn't surprised. A man like Richard Montgomery could unravel an entire life overnight if he wanted to. He asked, "Did you come here to ask for funding?" She answered, "No. I came because you invited me." He gave a dry smile, the kind with no warmth, then stood and paced slowly behind his desk, voice no longer sharp, but steadier, more deliberate. "I want to hire you." Diana raised an eyebrow slightly. "Waitressing at your private residence?" "No," he said. "I want you to be Lucas's therapeutic companion. I have the best doctors, top therapists, cutting-edge equipment." "But you did something none of them could. You let the boy lead." Diana said nothing, eyes never leaving his. She didn't deflect, didn't fake modesty. She simply saw something others had missed. A father once convinced he could buy anything, now fumbling to reconnect with the one thing that can't be bought. He offered her 5 times her current income, enough to wipe away every financial struggle she had known for years. Diana stood. Number Richard blinked, not because she thought herself noble. She simply refused to work for someone who saw skin color and social class before he saw ability. And she especially would not work for a man who believed money could stand in for emotion. He snapped back. "You're rejecting this out of pride." She answered, "No, out of dignity. And because your son deserves someone who doesn't pretend to care." Before she left, she placed a small card on his desk. "Free classes every Tuesday and Thursday. If you want, bring Lucas." The door closed behind her, and for the first time, a man like Richard Montgomery was left alone in the kingdom he built. Out in the hallway, Winters stared at Diana like she'd lost her mind. "You just turned down Richard Montgomery. Are you insane?" Diana smiled faintly. "Maybe. But I'd rather be crazy than someone's possession." As she stepped out into the sun, the shadows fell long across the sidewalk. No one looked at her like a hero. No one knew what had just transpired. But inside her, something had shifted, not in Richard, in herself. She had stepped into the world of the powerful and walked out intact. And that was the start of a game none of them could predict. Wednesday afternoon, the golden light slid across the damp pavement, reflecting off the flawless paint of a silver Bentley parked outside the Freedom Steps Community Center. In the middle of the Bronx, surrounded by peeling walls and rows of aging one-story homes, the car stood out like a lost guest at a family gathering. Behind the tinted glass, Lucas's eyes followed the slow opening of the iron gate. There was no fear in his gaze, only a quiet kind of hope. Richard Montgomery sat still behind the wheel, his hand gently gripping the steering wheel. He wore khaki pants and a plain crewneck sweater, probably the most modest outfit in his entire wardrobe, but even that looked out of place on the cracked bricks and peeling paint of this neighborhood. Zoe, Diana's younger sister, tugged at her sleeve and whispered from behind the office window, "There's a Bentley out front, and I think the man inside is that boy's father." Diana didn't look right away. She simply asked, "Do you see anyone else with him?" "Yes, the boy's in the back seat. Looks like he wants to come in, but doesn't know if he should." Diana said nothing, her eyes fixed on the hand-painted sign above the front gate that read Freedom Steps. She had no special plans for this afternoon, just the regular session. But Lucas's eyes, during that silent dance, had already said more than any words ever could. Zoe mumbled men like him Don't walk into places like this." Diana gave a slight nod, but her eyes told a different story. Not every door needs a key. Some doors only need someone willing enough to stand behind them and invite another in. The car door clicked open. Lucas stepped out first. He still wore his braces, but his stance was steadier now. He scanned his surroundings like he was afraid someone would turn him away. He didn't need help walking. And then in a moment of still silence, the driver's side door opened. Richard Montgomery got out slowly, cautiously. His eyes drifted across the chipped walls, the old speakers playing music through broken wires, and the children running around with walkers and braces. No leather seats, no recessed lighting, no scent of imported oak. Only the raw space where people were learning to stand tall in their own way. Diana walked out to meet them. She greeted Lucas with a nod. She didn't say a word to Richard. And he didn't say anything either. It wasn't needed. Lucas's eyes had already spoken for both of them. Richard stepped back, leaned against the wall, hands in his pockets, his eyes fixed on his son. The boy walked in, joined a group of kids practicing simple motions to soft background music. A girl in a wheelchair spun in slow circles. A boy with a prosthetic leg bounced slightly to the rhythm. It all looked unstructured, chaotic even. But Diana whispered beside him, "It's got structure, just not the kind you're used to." Zoe handed Richard a plastic chair. He sat down uneasy, but not protesting. "This isn't therapy," he muttered. "I've hired the best in the field." Zoe replied softly, "And how far did that get Lucas?" The side door creaked open, and an older woman entered with a carved cane. Her hair was braided into silver twists, and her eyes held both sternness and grace. Dr. Elaine Mercer. Richard recognized her immediately, and his posture stiffened. She was the neuroscientist he had refused to fund 3 times in the past 2 years. He couldn't hide his surprise. His voice dropped. "I didn't expect to see you here." She said, "I'm not just here. I run the research being done at this very center. We're studying the effects of free-form movement on neural reorganization in children with motor impairments." Richard frowned. "I thought this was just some local dance class." Diana turned her voice steady. Freedom Steps is a pilot rehabilitation program based on theories of autonomy in movement. We blend adaptive dance with neurodevelopmental science. He asked then, "Why are you still waiting tables?" The answer came quickly: "Because no one funds us, and because people like you turned us down 3 times. Dr. Mercer added Diana co-authored those proposals. She had to leave grad school to care for her sister, but her academic contributions are exceptional." Richard stood still for a moment. "You knew who I was that very first night." Diana nodded. "From the moment you walked into the restaurant. And when Lucas stood up and invited me to dance, I knew chances like that don't come twice." He asked, "So was that dance planned?" The answer came without hesitation. "Number Lucas chose. I simply chose to follow." Just then, a small group of reporters entered the center. Richard whipped around, his eyes sharp. But Diana stayed calm. Zoe raised a folded newspaper with a headline hot off the press: "Breakthrough Movement Therapy Shows Promising Results." Dr. Mercer explained, "Today's the day we release Phase 1 findings." We invited the press to spread awareness. Richard's voice dropped. "You used my son for a publicity launch." Diana walked him into a small adjoining room where dozens of children's photos were pinned on the walls, each with handwritten notes of their progress. At the far end was an empty frame. He asked, "What's that one for?" Diana replied, "The future. The center we could build if we had the funding. 500 children a year instead of 50. Richard stood silent. His eyes no longer burned with anger. They were heavy now. He whispered, "You planned all of this. You brought me here on the exact day reporters arrived. You built this entire encounter from a dance." Diana answered, 4 months ago, when you canceled our meeting without reading the proposal, I promised myself I'd find another way. And that day, Lucas gave me the door in. Outside, the music kept playing. But it wasn't grand piano notes or stage-ready melodies. It was the blended rhythm of clumsy footsteps, spinning wheels, and grateful eyes of children being allowed, maybe for the first time, to lead the pace of their own lives. Richard didn't say another word, but he was listening. And for the first time in years, he wasn't playing the role of the one in control. He was sitting still in a room without central air, learning what it meant to follow. The music stopped. Every eye turned toward the center of the studio where Lucas stood, his small frame surrounded by a loose circle of children. No one told him to do anything. No one expected this moment. Just a second ago, he was swaying to the rhythm. His legs still braced his steps, still uneven. But then, as if something deep inside him rose to the surface, Lucas reached down and began unstrapping the brace from his right leg. The soft clang of metal touching the floor rang out like a challenge in the silence. Richard stood up instantly, his fatherly instinct kicking in, voice tight with worry. But Diana raised her hand. Wait. Her eyes met his. There was hesitation in his look, mixed with fear. She whispered, "Just give it a moment." Lucas took a long breath. He knew everyone was watching. He knew his father was there. He knew exactly what he was risking, and it was far more than a single step. A beat dropped from the speaker, then another steady and simple, like a countdown. He shifted weight to his left leg, arms slightly out for balance, then slowly lifted his right foot. The room held its breath. And then, like a small miracle, quiet enough to strike deep, Lucas took a full step. No brace, no help, no hand to hold. One small, shaky step entirely his own. The children erupted in cheers, applause, echoing through the room, spontaneous hugs and beaming smiles lighting up the space. Dr. Mercer allowed herself a proud smile, her eyes shimmering. Zoe gripped Diana's hand tightly, too moved to speak. Richard stood frozen, his once stern gaze now reflecting something unfamiliar. The quiet awe of a man who had long stopped believing in the impossible. Diana turned to him and said softly, "This is why we built Freedom Steps. Not to teach them to walk perfectly, but to help them take their first step in their own rhythm." Richard looked at his son and for the first time didn't see Lucas as a problem to solve or a guilt to pay for. He saw him as a human being finding his way in a world full of limits and doubts. He muttered, "This could have happened without the theatrics, without the media." Diana didn't argue. She nodded, "Maybe it could have if you had answered the first call. If you had read the proposal instead of tossing it just because the sender's name meant nothing to you." Richard fell silent. The accusation wasn't loud nor bitter, but it was sharp, like a clean blade that sliced through the thick skin of power without spilling blood, only leaving the truth behind. Behind them, the reporters began noticing. They realized Richard Montgomery was standing in the very classroom where his son had just taken a step without support. The story was suddenly more compelling than any press release. One reporter stepped forward, recorder in hand, and asked directly, "Mr. Montgomery, do you have any comments about your son becoming living proof of a method your foundation denied funding?" 3 times. Richard looked at Lucas, now hugging a girl in a wheelchair, and whispering something that made them both burst out laughing. The boy didn't care about cameras or lights or questions aimed at his father. He was just being 10 years old. And that, more than anything, was what Richard never thought he'd witness again. In front of the microphones, Richard Montgomery took a slow breath. He didn't flinch. He didn't lash out. He didn't hide. He simply said, "The hardest thing for someone like me is to admit that I was wrong." The room fell silent, not out of shock, but because those words were rare from a man so used to giving orders. He continued, "The Montgomery Foundation commits to fully funding Freedom Steps for the next 5 years and to building a specialized rehabilitation center based on the method developed by Miss Johnson and Dr. Mercer." Cameras snapped, flashes exploded. Zoe almost dropped Diana's hand in disbelief. Dr. Mercer stepped back, hand pressed to her chest, trying to steady her pulse. But Richard wasn't done. He looked at Diana, then back at the press, and with a clear voice said, with one condition: full operational and academic control must belong to Miss Johnson. No interference from any board or financial steering committee. Diana narrowed her eyes, not in suspicion, but in caution. She didn't nod right away. Because for her, no deal was more important than protecting the principle of freedom behind those first steps. Richard left the center after class ended. Lucas walked beside him, needing no help, only one hand lightly resting on the edge of Zoe's chair. Before reaching the door, he turned back and trotted over to Diana. He didn't say a word, just pressed a small plastic hair clip into her hand, sea blue in color. He smiled, eyes glowing, then turned and walked away without looking back. Diana stood there, staring at her palm. The little thing rested quietly between fingers hardened by years of labor, worthless in money. But it was proof, clear proof, that she had chosen the right path. That day, there was no golden plaque, no grand announcement, no long speech about historic partnerships between two different worlds. There was only a single step taken by a little boy, and a confession painfully honest from a man who once thought power could replace everything. And from that moment on, a different door began to open, not for the rich, but for the children who deserve the right to lead the pace of their own journey. The construction site went up just 3 weeks after the funding announcement. No press conference, no ceremonial signing, just the sound of earth movers grinding forward, hammers tapping rhythmically, and blueprint updates made daily, guided by parents, students, and the very children learning to walk in the rhythm of their own steps. Richard Montgomery showed up at the site every day like a habit he hadn't yet named. No assistant, no bodyguards. Just him, a man who once held the world in the palm of his hand, now holding a marker pen and circling spots on the plans for lighting adjustments in the sensory room. Diana stood nearby, silently observing. She didn't ask why he came each day. She didn't ask how far he'd read into the neuroscience documents she had co-authored with Dr. Mercer. But she noticed the yellow sticky notes scattered across the research corners, the handwritten comments in strong, blunt strokes. Not a sign of guilt, but the effort of learning again from scratch. Learning how to see a person without filtering through metrics or performance charts. One late afternoon, as the workers packed up, Diana stood on the freshly poured foundation, looking out at the open space to the south where she planned to build the free movement room. Richard appeared behind her, holding a stack of papers. She looked at him, waiting, but he didn't talk about timelines, didn't mention costs. He asked, "Why have you never accepted my apology?" Diana replied plainly, "Because you've never actually said one." He looked at her, the eyes once trained on balance sheets, now heavy with something slower. "I shifted funding. I rewrote policy. I stood before the press. I admitted I was wrong. She answered, "That's restitution. Not an apology. They're not the same." He dipped his head, not out of politeness, but because for once he had nothing left to counter with. Diana continued, "When someone apologizes, they don't attach conditions. They don't ask to be acknowledged for it. They simply admit that they were wrong, that someone else's pain was real, and that they failed to listen enough." In the makeshift office, tucked in a corner of the site, stacked with boxes of documents, a small photo of Lucas was taped to the wall. He's walking with just one brace. The photo wasn't taken by a professional, the lighting imperfect, the frame slightly off. But it was the first image Diana printed and pinned to the wall, a reminder that everything happening now began with one child standing up in a restaurant full of judgmental stares and one woman choosing to follow. 6 months passed. The new Freedom Step Center finished on schedule. No need for extended budgets, no excess. Every room designed not by medical standards, but based on real feedback from children who had gone through the pilot program. No large mirrors, no cold fluorescent lights, instead warm wooden floors and walls hand-painted by the very kids who had once tiptoed into those early sessions. In the heart of the main hall was a circular open space meant for spontaneous showcases. Lucas was the first to step out and lead a short dance with 3 others. No hesitation, no prompting. Richard stood in the corner of the hall, eyes fixed on his son's every move. He didn't step in, didn't guide, didn't signal. He just stood still like a quiet shadow, no longer the center of every decision. Diana came closer, her voice soft like a breeze. "He doesn't need you to hold him anymore." Richard nodded but whispered back, "But he still needs me there." She looked at him, and for the first time, there was no hesitation in her gaze, only silent agreement. That's the difference. Not to lead, just to be present. A journalist approached, someone who'd followed the story since the beginning. He asked, "What made you change?" Richard didn't answer right away. He looked over at Lucas, who was now kneeling beside a younger girl, gently helping her adjust her leg brace. He replied, "I used to think I was the one paving the road, but one day I realized the bravest thing I could do was stop and follow someone who had found a better one. Nothing in all the corporations I've run taught me that. Only a woman who once waited tables could." Diana didn't smile, but her eyes lit up not from the praise, but because the truth was finally seen clearly. No title needed, no applause. Just the knowledge that someone who once dismissed her now knew how to step back at the right time. Inside Diana's desk drawer, there's a hardbound notebook. No label, no design. Inside are behavioral notes, neurological reactions, individual progress, and Richard's handwritten comments. Red circles drawn around sections where she wrote about companions, not controllers. The handwriting wasn't perfect. Some lines were uneven, but it was honest. Proof that he was learning not to command, but to understand. No one knew what the center would look like 10 years from now. Whether policies would shift, whether funding would last, whether the early spotlight would dim. But in that moment, under that freshly raised roof, a child walked forward with his own strength. A father no longer claimed the right to lead. And a woman once told she didn't belong in luxury spaces stood in the center, not by taking the stage, but because the entire room turned toward her as the true axis of change. Not by power, not by volume, but by stepping in behind at the right time and holding fast to a faith that never bargained. It was a late August afternoon, sunlight stretching across the hand-painted wall of the center where hundreds of tiny fingerprints lined up like a symphony of persistence. The main hall was unusually quiet, not because it lacked people, but because every eye was fixed on Lucas. He stood in the center of the room, holding onto a wooden bar, trying to balance with only one braced leg. He didn't wait for a cue. He didn't wait for the music. He was trying again something that once seemed impossible. But this time it wasn't anyone's decision but his. Richard stepped forward the way he always did whenever his son faced danger. But Diana gently touched his arm, just whispered, "Don't break that moment." Lucas was breathing hard, eyes locked straight ahead, and slowly lifted his right foot off the floor. 1 second, 2. His whole body wobbled but did not fall. Then a step. No one spoke. The silence tightened like a held breath. He placed his foot down, managed to stand upright. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't straight, but it was intentional. No brace, no support, no guiding hand. When he turned around, sweat dripping from his forehead, a slow smile broke across his face like the last light of day shining through a window. The applause didn't erupt. It rose gently, like the soft thump of hearts stirred from within. Richard wiped his eyes, trying to hide the emotion he had long kept locked behind the armor of his executive glasses. He knew he had just witnessed something no doctor had predicted, no report had ever promised. But before he could speak, Diana leaned down to Lucas and whispered, "Today was the day you walked for yourself, not for anyone else. Don't let anyone turn that into their achievement." He nodded, eyes glistening but steady, then stepped back into the group like there had never been a performance at all. Richard walked outside, leaned against the balcony railing, staring far off. Diana followed unhurried. He said, "My son just did something I thought was impossible 2 years ago. Then why do I feel like I've been pushed out?" Diana replied, "Because you're used to being the one who leads. And when your son starts leading his own path, your old role no longer fits." He turned to look at her, not angry, just uncertain. She added, "It's not that you're no longer important. It's that you haven't learned how to step back while still being present." There was a long silence. Richard sighed. "That day, I really thought you staged the whole thing. The handshake, the dance, even inviting the press." Diana looked him straight in the eyes. "And if I admitted that I did, how would you feel?" He answered, "I'd feel used." She nodded, and that's the difference. "I don't need you to feel anything. I need you to see what you refuse to see. If you hadn't skipped that meeting, if you had read past the second page of our proposal, if you had believed in something beyond profit margins, I wouldn't have had to take those steps in your place." Richard chuckled softly, a laugh with no defenses, like someone had just peeled off the last mask. "So all this really started with a rejection." Diana replied, "Every real change starts with someone refusing to nod. And sometimes we have to stage an entire performance just to get someone to open their eyes." He turned again, his voice quieter. "What about that empty frame in the other room?" She said, "It's a symbol. For the next center, we want to build if more funding comes. A bigger place, more functional spaces, so no child has to wait 6 months for a trial class." Richard nodded, and his eyes didn't carry doubt anymore, but the weight of decisions already being made. That evening, as everyone was heading out, Lucas walked back into the training room, staring at the empty frame. He asked, "My mom once said every wall could become a window, right?" Diana nodded, "Only if you dare to shatter the first shadow blocking the light." He lowered his head, thinking, then ran off. And what he left behind wasn't a perfect stride, but a will that needed no proof. 3 days later, Richard showed up at the center's office with a team. Not assistants or executives, architects, specialists in learning spaces for children with sensory needs. He placed a new blueprint on Diana's desk, said plainly, "I don't want to build another building. I want to build a space where every child can lead their own path from the very first step." Diana unfolded the drawing, her hand pausing at the bottom corner, where a handwritten note read, "The place they lead, not where we guide." No words needed, no contracts, no media. Lucas's every step had rewritten the original proposal into concrete action, and this time Richard Montgomery wasn't the one giving orders. He was the one knocking, waiting to follow. In that moment, the world didn't shift because of a donation. It shifted because of a deeply personal decision made by a man who once lived by control, now learning how to trust. Trusting a boy who knew his own limits better than anyone. And trusting a woman who always knew when to stay behind yet still lead. The main Hall of Freedom steps that day wasn't filled with laughter or music like usual. There was no sound of children giggling or rhythmic beats echoing through the walls. There was only silence, a deep kind of silence that wrapped itself around the circle of children gathered in the middle of the room. And there, standing quietly at the center, was Lucas. His arms extended slightly, one leg bent behind him, his head tilted as if listening to something only he could hear. There was no cue. No music, just a long moment of stillness before he shifted his weight and took his first step. The silver brace still supported one leg, but the other had been removed earlier that week. No doctor had dared to predict it would happen this soon. Yet here he was balancing on his own because he chose to try again. Richard stood just beyond the glass doors, one hand resting lightly on the frame. His eyes never left the boy. He didn't step in, didn't interrupt the session. Though he had grown used to being the center of any room, the one whose presence changed outcomes, this time he stayed outside. Not because he was unimportant, but because he finally understood this moment didn't need him. Lucas turned slowly in place, his legs trembling but steady. Richard clenched his hand, not out of fear, but something else. Something he hadn't felt in a long time. He wasn't afraid his son would fall. He wasn't tempted to rush in and help. All he could feel was the weight of witnessing growth silent and real unfolding before him. And perhaps for the first time he realized his role was not to intervene, but to remember. Diana stood on the far end of the circle, her posture tall, her gaze glowing with pride. She didn't speak to Lucas when the session began. She didn't signal or guide. She knew today's steps were his alone, no cues, no direction. She had stepped back, not out of absence, but to give him space to discover his own strength. And in doing so, she let him feel that standing tall could come from no one but himself. After the session, when the children trickled out one by one, Lucas stayed behind, sitting alone on the wooden step by the window. Richard approached slow and quiet and sat next to his son. He said nothing at first. Then Lucas spoke softly, "I don't need both braces anymore." His voice was light, but his words carried weight. Richard nodded but hesitated, then asked, "Are you sure?" Lucas turned to him with a calm so steady it made his father's throat tighten. "I don't need to be perfect. I just need to walk on my own. That's what Miss Diana taught me." Richard didn't know whether to respond with words or wrap his son in a hug. In the end, he just placed a hand on the boy's back, a silent way of saying, "I see you. I believe you." Later that evening, when the building had emptied, Diana remained behind cleaning the floor of the training room. Not because no one else could, but because it had become her ritual. She liked touching the space she had helped create. Richard returned, standing at the doorway as he often did, but this time he stepped inside. She didn't look up. "What do you want to say?" she asked gently. He sat on a wooden chair nearby, his eyes fixed on her hands. "I used to think I could fix everything with action, with budgets, with decisions. But I've realized some things can't be bought or signed into existence or forced into order. Some things like trust you only feel." Slowly, uncertainly, she paused, turning to face him. The warm light from the window fell across his face, revealing lines of age and vulnerability that had never been so visible. He continued, "Lucas doesn't need me to walk anymore, but he still needs me to witness it. And I never understood that before." She nodded quietly, confirming what didn't need long explanations. Every child needs someone patient enough to stand on the sidelines, not to lead, but to bear witness to the steps they take alone. He asked, "Do you ever feel like you've lost something by walking behind others?" She paused. "Yes, of course. But I've learned not everyone walking behind is weaker. Sometimes stepping back is the bravest way to let someone else rise." There was no tension between them anymore. No class divide. No ideological clash. Just two people who had passed through pain and misunderstanding, standing at a point where each had finally learned something they once lacked. There were no victors here, only growth. The kind that begins when egos are set aside and both sides dare to meet in the middle. A week later, a board meeting took place in a quiet yet purposeful atmosphere. Richard sat at the center, flanked by Diana Doctor, Mercer, and the lead program team. That day's agenda wasn't about finance reports or business strategies. It was the plan to expand the Freedom Steps methodology to 3 more cities in the next year. For the first time, Diana's name appeared at the top of the proposal, not buried under titles, not as a token inclusion. She was named Director of Curriculum and Development. No annotation, no defense needed. Her presence in that room was the proof that value does not beg for approval. It simply becomes undeniable. As the meeting wrapped, a board member asked Richard why he had given full control of the program to someone without formal credentials. He replied simply, "I've had plenty of people with perfect resumes, but none of them had the courage to follow a child's lead. And I don't want to make the same mistake twice." Diana walked out of the meeting room not feeling victorious nor validated. She felt light, like someone who had danced to a beat with no defined rhythm, but trusted she would find her place in it. Because in the end, what she wanted was never position. It was space. Space for kids like Lucas to carve out their own path, and for adults who once only knew how to command to finally learn the delicate art of standing still at the right moment and following when it matters most. The opening ceremony of Freedom Steps took place on a gentle, sunny day. Not too dazzling, but just enough light to pass through the glass windows, casting long streaks on the smooth wooden floor. The space was filled with the sounds of tiny footsteps, scattered laughter, and the soft tapping of mobility aids on the ground, like the unique rhythm of this world. There was no red ribbon to cut, no long-winded speeches, only a small wooden nameplate hung by the very children who had gone through the walking journey in the old center. On it, hand-carved, were the words, "Every step is a beginning." Lucas led a short opening dance with 3 other young kids. He wore a white t-shirt, soft khaki pants, and pale blue sneakers. His left leg brace was now so light it could barely be noticed from a distance. He no longer needed cues. no longer looked down at his feet. Every move had become instinctive with no trace of anxiety. As he made a slow spin, he looked toward the end of the hall where Richard stood silently, hands in pockets, his face unreadable, but his eyes stirred with emotion. He didn't lift his phone to record, didn't take notes in his small notebook. He simply stood there like a true spectator for the first time, not interfering in an event that had everything to do with him. Diana stepped closer, stood beside him without speaking for a while. Finally, she whispered, "He doesn't need your hand anymore." Richard nodded, his eyes still fixed on the stage. "I know, but he still needs me to be here." That reply didn't come from logic, but from a deeper place where he had buried fear, the haunting sense of failure and helplessness when he couldn't do anything for his son. For the first time, he admitted that love doesn't always need to show up as grand gestures. Sometimes it's just being present in the right way at the right time. A journalist approached, requesting a quick interview. Richard turned to Diana, seeking permission with a glance, then stepped in front of the camera. The first question came, "Mr. Montgomery, how does it feel seeing your son surpass every expectation?" He looked at Lucas, who was helping a young girl in the group up after a small stumble, and said, "I'm proud not because he overcame what they called limits, but because he's now creating something for others." The reporter followed up, "What is the biggest lesson you've learned from this journey?" Richard answered without pause, "A true leader is not the one who walks ahead thinking they know the way, but the one brave enough to follow when someone else shows a better path." Diana stood behind the camera, her eyes dry, but her heart overwhelmed. Not because he mentioned her, but because he finally understood. Everything she had fought for, everything she had risked her job and reputation for now, needed no defense. It spoke for itself. In a child who could walk his own path, in a father who once believed he had control over everything, now stepping back to start over. 1 year later, the program expanded to 3 other cities. Major hospitals began integrating the Freedom Steps method into their pediatric rehabilitation plans. Diana received a national award for innovation in pediatric recovery. She arrived to accept the award in a neutral-tone dress, not glittery, not striking, but her presence commanded the room. When she spoke, she didn't talk about the building or about numbers. She told the story of a little boy who once invited her to dance in an upscale restaurant under the heavy silence of powerful gazes. She spoke about how she didn't say no, and how that boy didn't just lead her into a dance, but into a journey no one expected. At the end of her speech, she said one simple line: "Every great change begins with a small action when someone dares not to look away." After the ceremony, as people exited the hall, Lucas waited outside, holding his old walking cane, now shortened and painted deep red. He said, "I don't need this anymore, but I want to keep it as a memory." Diana took it gently, running her hand over the smooth wood, nodding without words. Some keepsakes don't need display, only quiet existence to remind us there was once a time we trembled with every step, but still chose to walk. That evening, Richard called her not for work, not to resolve a problem. He said, "I just reread your speech, and I realized I've never thanked you." Diana smiled softly. "You didn't need to say it. I already felt it." He was silent for a few seconds, then said, "And to think, I used to believe I needed to spend money to prove I'd changed." She replied, "Some things can't be measured in money, but in the movement of someone who stood still for too long." The call ended with no formalities, no promises to meet again. Between two people once on opposite ends of the power scale, now stood a delicate but real balance. One had learned to give up the role of the guide. The other had proven that value isn't about where you begin, but where you're willing to stop and listen. And between them stood a boy who once needed someone to hold his hand, now reaching out to lead those still hesitant behind him. Executive meetings at the Montgomery Foundation had long been known for their flawless precision. A long table, black leather chairs, full-color reports and spreadsheets down to the last decimal. But today, in that very room, what captured attention wasn't a graph, but Richard Montgomery's silence. He didn't interrupt, didn't issue directives, didn't flip through papers, hunting for flaws. He simply sat still, listening as Diana Johnson presented her plan to expand the Freedom Steps program into regions long neglected by rehabilitative medicine. Rural towns, laborer communities, places where children with disabilities were seen more as burdens than as potential. Her voice didn't rise, didn't rush, and she used no flashy phrases to create impact. She spoke as if everything she said already existed in the hearts of the listeners, and her task was only to gently awaken what lay dormant. She didn't ask for permission. She simply stated what needed to be done. Because it was time. Time for a method that no longer placed guidance in the hands of doctors or teachers, but returned it to the children themselves to be extended not just where cameras could reach, but where no one had thought to look. When the presentation ended, there was a pause. A board member glanced at Richard, waiting for him to break the silence, but he simply nodded, signaling them to move on. No one was surprised anymore. They had grown used to the quiet version of Richard Montgomery, more reserved, less verbal, a man who had stepped away from center stage, but remained as a calm presence in the wings. And it was that very silence that gave his decision since then more weight than any written memo. Diana left the boardroom with no contracts in hand, no congratulatory remarks trailing behind. She walked through the long corridor of Montgomery Tower, a place that once made her feel small and misplaced. But now her footsteps echoed with steadiness, not because she had been recognized, but because she no longer needed recognition to walk confidently. That afternoon, Lucas dropped by the new center after school. He no longer needed anyone to escort him, no longer walked side by side with an adult. He came with a classmate carrying a sketch pad and ideas for designing the community room's signage. When he walked in, he greeted everyone with a slight nod, like a host, familiar with the rhythm of his own space. Diana saw him from afar. Her eyes brightened for a moment, but she didn't rush over or offer praise. She knew he didn't need it. What he had was far more valuable, the sense of belonging to a place that no longer required him to be held up. A while later, Richard arrived. He didn't head straight to his office like usual. Instead, he settled in the parents' lounge, where soft fabric chairs and low tea tables welcomed quiet conversation. In his hand was a blue notebook filled with personal notes about Lucas's recovery journey. Words never meant for anyone else to read now, rewritten in his own hand as a kind of personal legacy. When Diana approached, he handed her the notebook without a word. She opened it and saw the first pages detailing timelines. Small changes in Lucas's gait, the tone in his voice, the look in his eyes. And on the last page, a single sentence in slightly crooked, firm handwriting. "Thank you for not teaching my son the way others do, but for letting him teach us how to see children differently." Diana closed the notebook without replying. A nod was enough, because she understood that some thank yous, when spoken aloud, lose their truest weight. She carried the notebook to her office and placed it next to academic reports beneath a folder proposing the integration of the method into special education schools. No one had to say it, but everyone knew the handover had happened. Not through a contract, not through a formal declaration, but through the silence of a man who once held everything, now choosing to let go so others could carry on. The following week, Lucas gave a short speech during the center's community day. He didn't talk about his own achievements, but about his friends, those who arrived fearful and left standing tall. He said, "People think they need help to walk forward, but sometimes we just need someone willing to stand still long enough for us to find our own rhythm." The room fell silent. Other kids sat straighter. Parents reached for each other's hands beneath the tables. Richard stood in the back, eyes fixed on the boy. No more worry, no more quiet fear that his son might fall. Only the quiet awe of a man witnessing something greater than any deal he had ever closed. When the event ended, Lucas stepped down from the stage, walking through the crowd unassisted. He reached Richard without saying a word. The man bent down and held his son for a long time. Not the embrace of a protector, but the quiet apology of a father who once doubted his child's strength. And when they let go, there were no tears, no looking back. They walked away in different directions, as if the road ahead was finally strong enough that they no longer needed to hold hands. In a world where major decisions often come with signatures and seals, there was a father who chose to acknowledge his mistakes with silence. A woman who redefined leadership not through power, but through trust. And a boy who once sat quietly in a wheelchair, now standing in a crowded room, teaching everyone how to listen to that first imperfect but most honest step of a human life. At the new Freedom Step Center, where the natural light was designed to fall just right onto the wooden floors of every therapy room, a large photo had just been hung in the most honored spot. It wasn't a portrait of any donor or founder, nor a moment from some grand opening ceremony. The photo captured Lucas bending down to help a little girl adjust her back brace, both their faces slick with sweat, their eyes focused, and behind them only an open space filled with sunlight. No caption, no title. Anyone who had ever stepped foot in this place understood the weight of that moment when guidance no longer came from adults, but was passed into the hands of the children themselves. Lucas was now in high school. He stood taller, his hair a bit longer, and sometimes he came to the center not to train, but simply to read alongside the younger kids who had just joined. He wasn't assigned any official task, didn't carry a title, yet every child turned to him when things got tough. Not because he gave instructions, but because he listened without judgment. He never rushed anyone to get up if they weren't ready. He never offered praise that felt like evaluation. He simply showed up just like Diana once had. And now no one needed to teach him how. He had become the one passing it on. During an internal meeting, as the board and staff gathered to review 3 years of work, a representative from the health department asked Diana how many more centers her method could be scaled into. She replied, "We don't measure success by the number of centers, but by the number of children who learn how to rise on their own. Because if no one truly listens, even 100 new buildings won't create real healing." The room went quiet. Then came a simple nod. No further reasoning needed. A few weeks later, Richard showed up at the center on a light, rainy afternoon. He wore a dark raincoat, his shoes muddied from just visiting the new site in a distant rural area chosen for the next expansion. He didn't announce his arrival, didn't ask for a meeting. He simply sat in a quiet corner of the therapy room watching a group of kids practicing balance. Some couldn't stand longer than 3 seconds. Some fell again and again. Some cried mid-session, but no one was forced to try again. Every fall was part of learning. Every pause was a chance to ask yourself if you still wanted to go on. No one was left behind and no one was dragged forward. Diana came and sat beside him after a while. They didn't speak. Outside, the rain murmured against the windows. The sound of wheels on wood filled the room with a strange rhythm. Richard pointed at a small girl struggling to remove her leg brace, hands trembling, but eyes bright, and whispered, "What's her name?" Diana answered, "Hannah. She just joined last week. She's been through 3 centers already. None kept her for more than a month." Richard stayed silent, still watching, then exhaled slowly. Back then, I would have called her a statistical failure. Now I just see a child trying in her own way. She turned to him and asked gently, "And you, what are you trying to do now?" He smiled for the first time since he walked in. "I'm not trying anymore. I'm just learning to be present." And in doing so, I realized something that 30 years in finance never taught me, that not all progress can be measured by time or efficiency. Some things can only be measured by how patient we're willing to be, even when that means doing nothing at all except staying. Diana stood up and walked over to Hannah. She didn't instruct her. She simply handed the girl a bottle of water and gave a small nod. Hannah looked up, smiled faintly, and turned back to her session. Richard watched, and for the first time he understood why Diana had never wanted to turn this method into a business model. Because if a system begins with negotiation, it ends with compromise. But if it starts with patience, it continues through quiet presence. That evening in the small office beside the activity room, Diana opened a letter sent from a family in another state, where a new center had just opened. Inside was a note of thanks from parents of a boy who once didn't speak, didn't make contact, and couldn't walk more than 3 steps. Now he could walk and laugh at the same time, even if he still couldn't say a word. They wrote, "Thank you for not rushing. Because of you, we learned how to wait for our son to find his rhythm." She folded the letter and placed it beside the old notebook Richard had once handed her. Its cover had a few scratches from age, but inside the ink hadn't faded. "Thank you for letting my son teach us how to see children again." Outside, the rain had stopped. Water still clung to the windows, reflecting the hallway lights in soft patterns. Lucas was walking a small group out his steps, no longer holding any trace of hesitation. He paused at the door, turned to glance at the room where he'd once trembled through his first step, then quietly closed it behind him. No one clapped. No one called his name. But in that space, something had ended and something else had just begun. Not because someone reached a milestone, but because someone had learned how to let another walk forward without stepping in. And sometimes growing up doesn't happen in the first step you take, but in the choice to stay out of the way when someone else needs their own path. That's when silence becomes the loudest voice. And the one who finally speaks turns out to be the one who's been listening all along.